Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by John Jackson.
Hi, Karen.
And Emma Lindley-Thompson.
Hello.
Wonderful to have you both here. We're going to focus our attention on perhaps some of the research that might help us in the mathematics classroom. But first, John, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So I'm going to cheat here. I'm going to say two things. One kind of geeky academic paper I've been gradually working my way through is a book called Mathematics Teacher Noticing. It's edited by Sheeran, Jacobson, Phillip, and it's kind of a whole bunch of studies. It's quite long. It's taken me a long time to kind of gradually work my way through about what maths teachers to see in the classroom, what we might want them to see in the classroom, things like that. But more kind of accessibly, perhaps, I've just finished reading a kind of really cool book called Against Empathy by Paul Bloom, who's a psychologist. It's recommended to me by a friend. Rather than against empathy, it's better to describe it as like for compassion, but it makes a less good title. And he's also definitely against empathy. He basically says that empathy is like not a good moral guide for decision making. Because it's really vulnerable to bias and focuses in on individuals rather than kind of the bigger picture or people who are kind of more like less similar to us or more distant. Super interesting. I'm not totally bought into it, but it's definitely making me think pretty hard. Emma, what are you reading for?
Well, with a 2.5-year-old toddler, I'm currently reading, I thought it'd be good to share Rachel Bright's books. I'm kind of rotating through them in a minute. But the current favourites are The Lion Inside and The Koala Who Could. Now, these stories carry such wonderful messages I wanted to just share. So The Lion Inside reminds us that we don't have to be big and brave to find our own inner roar. And sometimes, even when we feel small, we discover we have the heart of a lion. And I just love that idea of everyone kind of having a unique roar to share. And then The Koala Who Could encourages embracing the joy of just trying something new. And I just find it fascinating and just amazing that children's stories can have really meaningful messages for us adults too. And then two other books that I wanted to share that I've just kind of really been inspired by recently is There's No Such Thing as Naughty by Kate Silverton. The book offers just really great practical ideas for those challenging moments when I remind myself that my child needs that kind of like self-regulation, and it's really helped view life a little bit more through my toddlers, about how important they, early years are, and this kind of like growing focus on this stage of development, kind of like the 0 to 5 years, which is supported by kind of organisations like Ambition Institute. It's just like really encouraging. And then the second book I wanted to share was Soppy by Mo Gawdat. I am a huge fan of his work. I highly recommend listening to podcasts that feature him. And his book introduces the fascinating happiness equation, which I will share with you, which is happiness is equal to or greater than of your life minus your expectation of how life should be. Now, as we discussed maths today, I thought this equation would be an interesting concept to share. So, Kieran, what are you reading for?
They all sound fascinating. I'm definitely going to add to my reading list as a result of that. But I'm going to cheat. I have been reading an expert edit written by John Jackson and Emma Lindley-Thompson called Helping Pupils Learn Maths. And I find, I said to John when he sent it to me, I hadn't really been doing any fun education reading. And that's still very much the case, but this was the most fun I'd had for a while because it was a really, really excellent distillation of some really useful and interesting research in the field of mathematics, which for me is we're often underserved by the types of studies that we find. And some of the things I was reading, I was like, this is excellent. And also you made it really accessible. So I'd highly recommend anyone check it out if they possibly can, if they haven't already. And I'll make sure I put a link to it in the sort of description for this episode. With that in mind, You've recently published a paper called Helping Pupils Learn Maths. What motivated you to do so? And how can teachers, leaders get the most from it?
Yeah, great question. I'll start us off with that. Well, I think first of all, kind of mathematics is a subject we engage with daily, both as educators and as individuals. And for some teachers, it is taught kind of explicitly through those dedicated maths lessons, while for others, it's embedded kind of implicitly into the fabric of like everyday learning. And it's worth just kind of sharing that at Ambition Institute, kind of we recognise the central role that kind of like maths plays. And so John and I decided to write a paper aimed at supporting teachers and school leaders in enhancing kind of pupils' maths understanding. So kind of, yeah, helping pupils learn maths. And kind of, as you've already kind of alluded to, Kieran, you know, research in maths education can feel sometimes quite dense and challenging to apply in practice. And with this paper, like John and I really wanted to try and bridge that gap by highlighting kind of key findings from relevant research and then presenting them. I'm really glad to hear you saying it was quite, you know, clear and accessible, because that was our actual one of our goals was, yeah, to make it really clear and accessible for everybody. And our goal was to kind of not only, you know, summarise these insights, but also to kind of encourage educators to reflect on their own teaching practice and consider how these findings might inform and enrich kind of their work in you know, their unique context. So kind of throughout the expert edit, there were opportunities for you to kind of reflect and make any notes after each of the research papers, and there's some questions in there as well. And you know, through publishing the paper, we really hope that it will kind of like spark those conversations in schools, you know, out of school time, kind of like thinking about, like reflecting on some of those questions, inspire some kind of practical strategies that can be used in the classroom. Maybe it could be taken along to staff meetings, any kind of like reading clubs that, you know, staff might have, you know, within their school settings, outside of school. And, you know, maybe it can support professional development sessions as people are planning those sessions as you know, term by term and year on year, and kind of empower both teachers and learners in the journey of mathematics discovery.
Yeah, I think my motivation is pretty similar to yours. Like I kind of like to develop that point about like accessibility and applying education research to maths classrooms, because I think that was particularly important to me for like a few reasons. That we've got quite a lot of fairly well known kind of subject agnostic research from sort of cognitive science around things like worked examples and retrieval and so on. But that's not often particularly targeted at school level mathematics. And although that's quite well known, like a lot of the subject specific research in maths is not well known like that, particularly anything that's kind of lab based. And it's much harder for teachers and for me as well to kind of find and make sense of that research. And so I thought it was really a great opportunity for us to sort of spotlight some of that. Particularly as kind of quite a lot of what there is already around like maths research, a lot of it is quite heavily theory focused. So things like concrete pictorial abstract, whether we teach for conceptual or procedural understanding and the balance between that, variation theory, things like that. And quite often that research doesn't really address the kind of question of what the impact is on pupil learning. And that's like kind of quite frustrating, I think, for me. So but there is research out there that does that, and I kind of want to kind of spotlight that, because theory is important because it helps us make predictions about stuff. But I wouldn't really want to advocate for big like pedagogic changes in the classroom without like some kind of evidence that that's going to work. So I was really keen for us to find papers that did sort of one of three things, like provided evidence for theory. So there's a Fife et al. Paper that we talk about in there about aiding concrete examples and concrete representations, sort of links to concrete pictorial abstract. Second thing was like applying cognitive science to the classroom, which is the kind of Rohrer et al. Paper on interleaving, which I think we're going to talk about a bit. Or finally, like tested out something that teachers do and found out is there kind of empirical evidence for that. This is a Riddle-Johnson paper on like comparing strategies. I mean, coming back to the accessibility piece again, there is really great research on like whether we should teach for conceptual or procedural understanding. Spoiler, like both. But we didn't select those papers because they were really hard to kind of like excerpt out of, and they were very technical. We'd kind of had to have rewritten them almost, which wasn't the kind of intention of the piece. And yeah, I agree with Emma in terms of how teachers and leaders can get the most out of this. Discussing and sharing with colleagues, like making sense of it and having those conversations will mean that it sticks. You get a better idea of how you're going to apply it in your classrooms, what the kind of problems or difficulties with that are. And then just start small. Try like one small thing. Don't try and read the whole expert edit and think, okay, I'm going to do all of these things at once, because it'll be very difficult and overwhelming. Start with something small.
The first thing that stood out to me was your paper selection. I thought that, you guys at Ambition always choose really good papers. Like, when talking to Nick Pointer, he always knows the best CPD ones to go to. And then obviously Chris in his reading, so I shouldn't have been surprised. And but I was like, yeah, this is excellent, because it might be, I think, roughly 40 pages for that Rohrer one that we're going to spend most of our time talking about. But what you've done, you've got like Emma and John's notes at the side and stuff, where you almost what's this telling me, and then you've got the actual extract that you had permission from and stuff. And I thought, it really stands out, because it's a really good starting point for anyone who wants to think more carefully, more deeply about this kind of stuff, but maybe is put off by the usual things. So I think it makes sense that those were your aims, because I think you've done a really good job of meeting those. Reading it, realizing that we couldn't possibly cover everything in depth in the space of one episode, I thought it'd be really good to focus our attention on the paper's called A Randomized Control Trial of Interleaved Mathematics Practice, and that's by Rohrer, Dedrick, Hartwig, and Chung. Why did this paper appeal to you?
Perhaps before I answer the question, it's maybe worth a bit of clarification about what the paper's about, because a randomized control trial of interleaved mathematics practice is maybe not the most accessible thing. And to add to that confusion, even if you know what interleaving means, it gets used for a bunch of different things, both by in schools and by researchers. So it's probably worth being really clear. Basically, this paper looks at whether mixing up or interleaving the practice that pupils do is better than blocking practice. So basically the question is it better to give pupils 10 questions which are all about adding fractions, which is blocking the practice, or is it better to mix those 10 questions up so that, say, 4 or 5 are about adding practice and then the others adding fractions, and the others are on topics like perimeter or adding whole numbers, and the fractions questions are jumbled up in between those. And the paper looks at that from the perspective of long-term learning. So does interleaving, mixing up rather than blocking practice, mean that pupils do better on a test at a later date? And that's kind of important because, as I said, interleaving can have various different meanings. So there's interesting research that looks at mixing up the examples that you give pupils as part of helping them make sense of new ideas. And that's kind of interleaving for acquisition, I would sort of say, rather than kind of long-term learning. And it's sometimes also used to help pupils make connections between ideas. This paper's not looking at those things. It's just looking at mixing up the practice that pupils do, interleaving the practice, to boost their retention of things that have already been taught.
I thought it was really interesting that they defined it as no 2 consecutive questions would be on the same mathematical idea. I mean, how does that sit with you? Do you think that's, from a feasibility position, were you happy with the definition, or do you think it could have been extended?
I think I'm not too hung up on that. I think it's probably it's important for them to have clarity as researchers so that people can kind of replicate the research. I think there's definitely circumstances where you might want to have 2 questions in a row and then change, because perhaps if you're working with pupils and they're going to get the first one wrong, you kind of want another one that you might want to give them some help with or something like that. But the important thing, and I think we'll probably keep coming back to that, is that like pupils are repeatedly having to figure out what they've got to do. It might be less useful to do 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, because they'll always know that the second one is the same as the first one after a while. I don't think it's like a really big deal. Basically, I think it's great. Like I'm a big fan, really enthusiastic about this paper, because it's both really clever, the kind of design of it, and it's really practical. And so my kind of initial interest stemmed from, as I sort of talked about earlier, it's a maths classroom based study of something that's quite well established in cognitive science, that mixing up the practice, the interleaving, can improve learning, but putting it into that context of the classroom. And then when I read the paper, like seeing the impact of that interleaving, like mixing up the practice, just being absolutely massive. Like even though it's a really simple design, all that teachers had to do was give pupils a worksheet of 8 mixed problems every week for a term. And what that led to was their average test scores compared to the group that just got the block practice. They went from 38%, they were 38% with the block group, an average score on the test, to 61% in the interleaved group, which is an enormous difference. And so that really caught my attention. And then it's just really well designed. So like they got teachers who were teaching multiple classes, and got them to give the block sheets to one class and the interleaved sheets to another class. So it wasn't just they happened to give the good teachers the interleaved sheets, for example. And that meant they had to be dead clever, because if you were just giving out worksheets that look different, then obviously the teachers and the pupils would be able to see which one they were getting, and that might influence the outcomes. But they found a really kind of neat way around that, so that you couldn't tell whether, as a teacher or a pupil, you'd got the blocked or the interleaved practice. I need diagrams to explain that with like clarity, so I'm not going to get into it here because I think it will be confusing. But basically, I managed to hide whether that practice was blocked or interleaved by having some additional topics on the worksheets. Kind of last couple of points, as you can tell, I really like the paper. The sample size is also really large, which I like. It's like 787 pupils, 54 classes, 15 different teachers, which is really refreshing in like applied educational research. I spend a lot of time reading studies with like sample sizes of 20, which just makes me think of the shampoo adverts where you've got like, it says 90% of people prefer brand X, and at the bottom of the screen, the sample's 10 people. It's worth noting that I'm not a statistician, so I might be making some spurious criticism here. And then finally, there's like a delay between the studying and the test, so it's actually measuring like learning and not performance. And it'd be really cheap for schools to do this. There are some limitations, but I'm going to be quiet now and let Emma talk for a bit.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that shampoo analogy. It just made me laugh. Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, really great like explanation there on the paper. I suppose just to add a little bit onto that before we get into the limitations. I suppose one of the reasons why kind of this paper kind of appealed to me was that like interleaving, though it's not as widely understood as other cognitive science principles like cognitive load theory or retrieval practice, it is gaining recognition for its potential impact on learning. And this paper really highlights that, the impact that interleaved practice can, significantly enhance outcomes, as John's just outlined. And evidence by classroom study shows that, really stronger emphasis on interleaving had, led to like dramatic improvements in test scores. I suppose while education, encompasses much more, in my opinion, than just test performance, I want to say that it's undeniable that test results remain like critical gateways for our pupils, and if a strategy like interleaving positively influences their learning and ability to excel in assessments, I think it warrants our attention. Every school day, many millions of pupils will complete a set of practice problems in mathematics that can be solved with the same strategies, such as adding fractions by finding a common denominator, and I suppose incorporating interleaved practice so that no 2 consecutive problems can be solved, or as John explained earlier, having that kind of repeated kind of pattern, whether it's 2 and 2 and etc. can encourage pupils to choose that appropriate strategy for each problem on the basis of the problem itself. And while there is place for block practice, I know we'll kind of talk a bit more about this. Pupils can approach the tasks knowing the method required without having to discern it for themselves. But by integrating kind of interleaved practice into our maths curriculum, we can kind of better equip our pupils to identify and apply the appropriate strategies for solving, that variety of problems. And as a former primary school teacher and leader, I kind of know firsthand how challenging, how crucial this skill is, but also how challenging it can be to develop. And I suppose the paper really resonates with me because it really, I think it helps address that kind of common issue that we see sometimes in schools, which is that pupils can often struggle to determine which concepts and procedures to apply to specific problems, particularly when similar problems, similar looking problems demand kind of like different approaches. So the findings are compelling. I think it's worth saying, and the cognitive science research that supports the idea that mixing problems, that interleaving, it does enhance pupils' performance by encouraging them to think critically, which I'm sure all your listeners are, championing that, Kieran, and set and support pupils to kind of select that, those, the right strategies for, a range of different challenges.
It's really good hearing you say that from a primary perspective as well. Like I'm from a secondary background, and it's just really nice to see that the paper, and we talked about this a lot when we were kind of writing the expert edit, crosses across all phases and so on. It's obviously not a perfect paper. There's loads of the sample. It might not be representative of all contexts. It seems like they maybe just use schools that were close to the university, which might bias things. And none of the pupils were kind of low attaining pupils. And we also don't really know what teachers did between the kind of practice sessions. But despite that, I think it's really strong. The authors are also quite keen to acknowledge these things. They acknowledge that potentially quite a bit of the interleaving effect might be down to spaced practice or retrieval, both of which we know are really powerful in themselves. But I'm not sure how we'd ever disentangle that, because as soon as you start mixing stuff up, you are automatically spacing things out and having to get people to recall stuff. So I'm generally quite skeptical of anything that says it's got a really big effect. But despite that, I think they've done the study so well that I think it's such a powerful paper.
They did a pretty good job themselves of making it accessible. Like you say, the limitations. There's a little box, or it's almost a box, where 4 points here, and there was never too much of a burden on prior knowledge or the requirement to have a lot of academic knowledge to engage with this paper. I can see why it appealed, and that entanglement of the different sort of phenomena, I think they did a fairly good job of explaining where they're coming from in terms of it. Are there any specific characteristics of interleaved practice that you do think did contribute most significantly to its effectiveness?
Great question. I think there's a number of key characteristics that we could talk about. I'm just going to kind of pull out 4 to kind of share with you. I think one of them is the spacing effect. So interleaved practice, can naturally space out learning sessions, allowing kind of pupils to revisit those topics over time. And this obviously this spacing kind of strengthens that memory, reducing kind of forgetting and promoting that kind of long-term retention. Another one, it kind of creates that desirable difficulty. So by mixing different topics and types of problems, interleaved practice can kind of creates that desirable difficulty. And then learners are kind of forced to kind of distinguish between problem types, supporting their, improving their ability to kind of transfer that knowledge to new contexts. Strategy selection for problem solving. So again, in my experience, teachers and colleagues have often shared that kind of frustration and challenge that some pupils find it really difficult to select the appropriate strategy to use when problem solving. And interleaving practice can help with this, as switching between topics can enhance that cognitive flexibility. which will support pupils to kind of develop like better problem-solving approaches and adapt strategies when kind of encountering these situations. And then the last one I just wanted to share, I think, is around like the retrieval practice. So interleaving and retrieval practice, I think are really closely linked. That need to retrieve previously learned kind of content during interleaved practice can really strengthen pupils' ability to recall, and that kind of frequent retrieval from long-term memory can help build knowledge and reduce pupils' kind of dependence on that short-term memory.
I think picking up on your point around strategy selection in terms of how interleaving helps with that, mixing up the practice questions forces pupils to think harder, and we remember or like learn what we think hard about, and like that kind of idea of strategy selection is something the same researchers talk about in a different paper, some of the same researchers, called The Scarcity of Interleaved Practice in Mathematics Textbooks. They're big on like catchy titles. Basically, they're saying if we give pupils block practice, as you sort of just said, Emma, they kind of know what to do, and interleaving forces them to like actually have to select that right strategy. And kind of, as you said, it's what Bjork and Bjork would call like a desirable difficulty. So it makes things harder, so they do less well in the short term, but it pays off in the long term. And I suppose actually that's something in the paper that they draw attention to, is that it does take a bit longer. They said people spent more time doing the problems when they were interleaved than when they were blocked. But the payoff seems so large that it seems worth that. And then the last couple of bits are, I think, this first one is kind of super important, is that the interleaved practice comes after the initial learning. So like kids have been taught something, whether that's fractions or like probability or equations or whatever. They've had kind of a chance to get their heads around that and do some practice. And then the interleaving happens later. It might not be loads later. It might be like the next day or the next week or whatever. But that's really important. If they went straight into that interleaved practice, it'd probably be pretty overwhelming. And the researchers are kind of really clear on that. They say that like that initial teaching probably would include some block practice, which is great as well. Like as kind of like maths teachers of maths, that we know that's what happens in our classrooms, and that's important from our own experience. So it's quite useful to hear researchers saying that matters. I was trying to think of a good analogy for this. I don't know if this is a good analogy. So Kieran, you might want to just cut this from the podcast later, but I feel like it's a bit like learning to park in a bay when you're learning to drive. You sort of want to learn to go in like forwards, and you want to learn to go in backwards, but you probably want to get the hang of both of those before you start mixing them up. But you definitely do have to mix them up, because when you turn up in a car park after you've passed your test, there's not a sign saying go into this bay forwards or go into this bay backwards. You have to figure it out for yourself. So yeah, I don't know if that analogy works, but I was kind of trying to play around with it. I think that's kind of it in terms of the main characteristic.
I think it does. I'm pretty sure you get block practice on different maneuvers, and then eventually you'll be out for a drive, closer to your test, and you'll just be doing whatever one happens to be on the route. So I think that could definitely work. I mean, it feels as if, I don't know if this is the right word, but it's almost like interleaving feels like almost this linchpin that's connecting lots of other different ideas. And is it perhaps one of the most underutilized? And I'm obviously asking you to sort of for supposition. Is it underutilized because we needed to get all the other stuff right first, and how that looked in the classroom right first? Because I remember first reading about this in David Didau's What If book, and that must have been 2013, 2014. But I also remember not feeling equipped to actually use the information. I could see what he was trying to tell us, but I didn't know what it meant in my classroom. But 10 years later, it feels like we've got a much better idea. Am I on the right track? Or, obviously I'm just sort of hypothesizing here, but it feels like we're at this point because of the conversations we've had, because there's a lot of prior knowledge there about different sort of cognitive effects and the different sort of ways in which we sort of learn. Do you think there might be a relationship between the two?
I think there's probably two ways of looking at that. I think in terms of thinking about why it works, all of that prior knowledge you just talked about around retrieval, and Emma was talking about as well with spacing, is really important. But I think, and particularly at secondary, even more so than stuff like, because one of the kind of I don't really think it's a criticism, but one of the points raised around sort of cognitive science research is it's like, well, good teachers have always done this stuff. And like, I think definitely a secondary, can't speak to primary as much on this point, but I think good teachers have always mixed up practice problems. I can remember my own GCSE worksheets, which is a good 20 odd years ago now. I had a really fantastic maths teacher, and he mixed up the problems on the worksheets. He made them himself, I think. But and textbooks have always had mixed exercises in. I think maybe what we haven't had is like that understanding of the level of significance involved in it. Yeah, and I think it's knowing how important it is, like that it's worth missing some other stuff, perhaps, like maybe not covering some smaller topics in as much depth, or maybe not getting pupils as fluent to begin with before you start mixing it up. I think that's perhaps the thing that's different.
I was smiling through that because I totally agree. I think, when you kind of read it or listen to this conversation, lots of listeners may be thinking, well, yes, I've been doing that for a very, very long time, and maybe it's just that actually we're just naming it now. We've just got maybe a label for it, and obviously, we've more research is happening and has happened, and we're becoming more and more aware of these things. But I think it is exactly as you say, John. I think it's potentially always been there. We just know more about it now, and I think, as I said, we now have maybe a name for it, which I don't know, we may not have had before, or and maybe we've seen more of the impact it can have. And I think this paper, along with other research papers, is kind of pointing into the direction of this is actually making a difference to our pupils when it comes to particularly like classroom practice, or and particularly for this paper, like test results. So yeah, I feel like it's maybe always been there, but now we've maybe just drilled down into like the impact it can have or is having.
And this is common to lots of things in maths in particular. I think a really big barrier is textbooks. Like lack of use of textbooks potentially, in terms of it makes it harder to find practice questions, but B, that textbooks just don't have anywhere near enough interleaving in, or interleaving that's structured in a really good way. If you're lucky, you get a mixed exercise at the end of each topic. And this paper would suggest that we should be doing a lot more than that.
They obviously implore textbook authors, and now here and there they've got a second paper where they do the same thing, but for the whole duration. Because those authors are best placed to put regular tasks which draw on the things that have come previously in the curriculum and stuff. And in this study, the worksheets were designed for the teachers. Do you think there's any opportunity cost that perhaps wasn't reflected because the teachers weren't the authors? Because obviously they were surveyed and said it was really easy to implement. But if you're the person who's going through textbooks and choosing an example from each of the subsequent things, how do you feel about that? I mean, I've got my own opinion, but I don't want to temper yours with how that might go.
So you're asking, like, are we losing something if we're using pre-planned interleaved practice rather than teachers creating their own?
I think it's more the reality which we would hope is the case. Like you described, you wish more textbooks took account of this. And in the study, they took account of it on the teacher's behalf. If we're in our reality where it's likely a teacher's going to be designing these tasks themselves, or it's the option between block practice that already exists within their textbook or scheme, or design your own 9-question sequence taken from multiple. Are we missing anything within this study? Because they reported positively about the implementation. Does that change it significantly enough, or do you reckon we can find a happy medium?
It's a great question. Because they took quite a simple definition of interleaving, like literally just mixing up questions. They're not worrying about which questions go in which order. And because there are kind of tools and so on out there that will generate questions now, particularly online, like things like MathSpot website, I think it's probably not too big a deal. I think, and it's the kind of thing that and this is maybe my secondary hat on a bit more actually, is that you, as a secondary team, you could definitely share the creation of that, in terms of even if it's just like selecting some questions from here and there. It's probably not as easy as it appeared in the situation, because you don't always have those kind of set up questions. But compared to the things teachers spend a lot of time creating already, I think it's low in terms of how much time you would have to spend doing it, even if you did like decide you want to copy and paste like a question from chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4 and jumble them about. I don't think it's a huge opportunity cost, but it's a really good question.
That's kind of like sharing across, the school, across trust, with like year partners as well. I think there's an opportunity there. And I think, like, as you say, John, like what teachers are already spending a lot of their time doing, this paper kind of shows that it can have like significant positive impact. And I suppose for me, I just was thinking about people can be thinking about their curriculum mapping, really planning when these interleaving sessions will come, and then working, as a team, if possible, with creating some of these questions. But yeah, really good point, Kieran.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree. I mean, in my ideal school, in my ideal setup, you're freeing up teachers' time, so when they're planning, this is the kind of thing they're thinking about. What questions am I asking? What order are those questions coming in? So we could definitely be more efficient. But I think, yeah, I mean, the bulk of our job is, okay, here's the general journey of mathematics. How do I support those pupils? And there's clearly a big benefit to be had, from this research. So a good investment of time in my book. What practical advice would you give to teachers who are keen to utilize interleaving and harness its power in the classroom?
I think this builds on that last kind of question really nicely, actually. I think don't spend ages making resources. Try and adapt or find some existing questions. You might even have like a worksheet where they can work horizontally instead of vertically through the questions, and that makes it interleaved or something like that. Obviously, some of your better mathematicians will probably spot which questions are there, but that's maybe not that bad a thing anyway. Like do some interleaving. Like if you do some, probably do a bit more. Like this is a worksheet every week they did. So I think that would really help. Make sure you taught the maths first. Like don't go straight in with interleaving, or don't give pupils topics on the interleaved worksheets that they haven't been taught yet, because it's not gonna help their kind of motivation and like competence and things like that. One of the things I think they picked up on in the paper is that feedback might be really important. They didn't test giving feedback or no feedback, but all the pupils got like right, wrong feedback and a kind of opportunity to correct their answers. It doesn't mean they spent ages and ages going through that. I think there's a kind of parallel there with your sort of retrieval starters. Like you need some feedback, but you probably don't want to spend ages on it and overtake your lesson. Make that kind of pitching things, like making sure pupils have got that chance to be competent, because interleaving makes it harder, like that desirable difficulty idea. So as soon as you mix up the questions, it gets harder. So if you also make the questions harder, it gets harder again, and they probably need more time and things like that. I would be really careful about relying on homework to do interleaving. I know this is even more the case at primary, but from a secondary point of view, that's probably where I've most made use of interleaving before, like when I was a head of department, because I wanted homework to do various different things, and interleaving was one of them. You really run the risk of pupils opting out. So if that's the only place they're getting interleaving, you're probably not going to get the full benefits from it. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it as homework, but it's maybe a bit risky to rely on that.
Slowly, I think, is one of my suggestions. Kind of like mix questions on addition and subtraction and multiplication, like during review sessions, after, as John's already said, like after they've had time doing block practice. Really key. Second one, kind of like group together. So like interleave content and concepts which are alike but also have kind of like differences. So kind of like fractions and decimals. My third one is kind of like all activities, so incorporate kind of warm-ups, quizzes, kind of like to maximise the benefits of spacing, retrieval and interleaving by kind of revisiting previously taught concepts in an interleaved format. For example, kind of like 1 or 2 questions from earlier units alongside kind of current material. Additionally, kind of like integrating interleaving across a variety or various activities like group work, individual practice, educational games, kind of like to reinforce learning in like diverse and engaging ways, really. And then the fourth one, I think for me, it's kind of like really sharing that purpose. Explain why are we doing it? Again, with my primary former co-head teacher hat on, it's kind of, why are we doing this? Why are we doing it like this? And kind of just really kind of framing it and explaining that why from kind of the get-go, really, and just explaining the impact and the benefits for pupils, and mixing up these topics, kind of using that phrase of like, this will help you remember better and apply these skills in kind of like new situations. And I think often we can kind of forget to kind of share our rationale and the why of why we're doing it like this, particularly if they've always done block practice or another kind of other kind of strategies. It's explaining that kind of why we're doing it.
What I like about that is that it's really manageable for teachers. It's very clear in terms of, okay, we teach, there will be block practice, opportunities for success, and then let's do a little bit more. It's fully in control. Because sometimes I'm asking, how much of this is, do you need like subject leader or senior leader support? It feels like this is a change you can make in your practice, right now, if you really wanted to. And the fact that it was once a week, do you reckon there's a limit? Do you think that was probably about the right? Was that a Goldilocks zone? Or do you think you could push more? Because obviously, we've got 5 practice sessions a week, maybe more in secondary. Do you reckon they were right in their sort of frequency, or do you think we could push the boundaries of that a bit?
They probably chose that because of like practicalities, is my guess. There's maybe a limit in terms of how quickly you're like encountering new topics to a point where you can interleave them. I think like once a week is like a really nice guide. I think everything else is contextual, whether it is like based on what your pupils like competence and confidence in terms of like doing maths is like, their age. Like I probably want A-level pupils to be doing quite a lot of interleave practice quite a lot of the time. The complexity of what you're teaching, because if you're doing quite complex problems with pupils, then you're invariably interleaving a bunch of different things in there.
It certainly felt like they were leaving the door open for further research. So I mean, it's only been 4 years, so probably anything they started around the time they finished would have come out maybe 2022. So I don't know, perhaps I mean, the version I got looked like it was someone's thesis, because there were notes left to themselves, like insert table here, and those are the kind of notes I leave to myself. But they hadn't finished it.
I think that because it's potentially a preprint as the open access one is my guess. Actually, once they had really useful diagrams in there, they actually shared, one of the things I loved about the paper is they shared the questions they used, examples of them and things like that, which I thought was really useful. But yeah, I should have another look and see what else they've produced.
Yeah, like I say, I mean, the fact that they're teacher friendly, they're asking important questions, and they're testing things that are going to be really, really impactful in the classroom. It feels like, if they go on a 20-year spree of conducting really effective research, it could be a game changer for certainly in the maths classroom, but it sounds like this could be, across the curriculum. Because obviously the big interleaving one is, whether you can tell Manet from Monet and stuff like that there. That's what always comes to mind when people mention it. So I think really, really positive. Now, we sort of alluded to some of this stuff as we've been going through. How do we avoid the many traps which have, I think, become too frequently associated with interleaving? For example, teaching a different topic every day of the week.
It's about balance. Balance what we eat, kind of to ensure like muscle groups get worked. And I kind of sometimes think of the different practices, like interleaving, retrieval practice, for example, and where they kind of like overlap and link. And it can often feel like really overwhelming for teachers and leaders to think about all of the number of different strategies that can be used in the classroom and which ones to kind of include. And I suppose thinking of like 3 traps. And then thinking about how we can avoid them to kind of share with you, which So one of them is kind of make practice tasks, interleaving, which I know John's kind of already spoken a little bit about. So avoid kind of interleaving when pupils are just at the beginning of learning a concept, kind of as we try to communicate it as clear as possible, like really start with that blocked practice. There is a place for it, and build that foundational understanding, and gradually introduce that interleaving once they're familiar with those basics. I think the second thing for me is like the trap could be focusing on like solely on interleaving without incorporating opportunities for retrieval practice. So kind of combine interleaving with retrieval practice by including like previously taught material in like quizzes and warm-ups or review activities, I mentioned earlier. And this reinforces that prior learning while also challenging pupils to discriminate kind of between the concepts. And then the third one is, for me, is about like not confusing spacing and interleaving. I really understand that spacing involves revisiting the same concept over intervals of, over time, while interleaving mixes like those concepts or problem types and kind of plan those activities that kind of integrate, both methods kind of as effectively as we can.
Yeah, I think in terms of avoiding traps, like it always comes back to sort of like being really clear about your purpose, which I think is kind of the thing I think most about when I'm kind of thinking about maths teaching. If we can be clear about what we're trying to achieve, we'll probably make better decisions about when to do it. And so in terms of interleaving, like what are we trying to achieve with teaching maths, like gradually building a deeper understanding of the subject, not just like throw all the cognitive science tactics we've got at it and hope that it works. And I think like that helps us avoid that like different topic from different day to day, because if you think about from the perspective of a pupil, that's unlikely to lead to that deeper understanding if you're varying things so much so quickly. So like having that clarity of purpose, and then similarly for interleaving itself, I think we talked at the start about it can be used for different reasons. So it might be like, okay, I really want to try and help people's retention, their ability to kind of like distinguish between different types of problems. Okay, interleave practice definitely is what you want. But if you're trying to help pupils understand what a parallelogram is compared to a trapezium or a rectangle, that's not about interleave practice. That's about those examples at the start of a lesson or topic where you're introducing it and you're showing them, getting pupils to compare. Both of those things can help learning, but they're different purposes. You just want to be really clear about what that purpose is. And then I think, finally, it's a desirable difficulty. That purpose is to make it a bit harder so that learning is better in the long term. Don't make it undesirable. Don't make it undesirably difficult by making it too hard or too confusing or do it too soon. I think those are the kind of key things, but bringing it always back to the kind of purpose you're going for helps you avoid those kind of traps.
Reading your paper, certainly reading extract 2 from your paper and listening to you guys speak about it, I don't think anyone's done as good a job of articulating how this could help us in the classroom. So I think a massive thank you on behalf of the profession. Like I said, this is one of those things I almost wouldn't touch for a long time because I wasn't clear how it was helpful. I mean, Neil Allman's got my copy of the wrong book. I'm going to need to go back and check if I was just being silly or if actually there's a bridge that's been sort of closed over or crossed since then, but we'll see. But I think it's been absolutely fascinating. I think anyone listening will have something actionable they can take and they can utilize in their, so if not in the classroom, tomorrow in their planning as the next week or so goes on. So all this I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Emma.
Thank you for the opportunity and thanks for having us. It's been really great to have this conversation, so thank you.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. I've really enjoyed this. Really interesting. So yeah, thanks for having us on.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.